So the epidermis and the cells that are found in the epidermis. So there are four cell types found in the epidermis. There are keratinocytes, melanocytes, dendritic cells, and Merkel cells. Keratinocytes are the epithelial cells of the epidermis, and they, of course, are the most common. There are three other types scattered among the keratinocytes. There are melanocytes, cells that make melanin pigment. There are dendritic cells, also called Langerhans cells, but that's an eponym, so I avoid it. That are phagocytes that are part of the immune system, and there are Merkel cells, which are specialized epithelial cells that are involved in sensation. So, as an intro to melanocytes, let's talk about the three pigments that contribute to skin color. There is melanin, which is a brown pigment, carotene, which is a yellow-orange pigment, and hemoglobin, which is a red pigment. So melanocytes make brown melanin pigment, and they then transfer the pigment to keratinocytes. Okay, so the color that you see in skin is not just from melanocytes having melanin in them, but in the keratinocytes throughout the epidermis having melanin in them. Melanocytes are found mostly in thin skin. They are 5 to 20% of the cells in the basal layer. They are more numerous in the nipples and the genital region, making those areas of the skin darker. Melanocytes are sparse in thick skin. Thick skin has little or no melanin. So even in quite dark-skinned people, the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet are more white or a pink-white color. Melanin protects the skin from damage by absorbing the ultraviolet radiation in sunlight and dissipating it as heat. Okay, so it converts the ultraviolet radiation into heat so that the ultraviolet radiation cannot damage the DNA inside cells. Melanocytes make more melanin when they are exposed to UV radiation, and that makes the skin get darker, or what we call get tanned. Too much UV radiation can damage the chromosomes in stem cells or melanocytes and cause skin cancer. Too much UV radiation can also damage the dermis and cause premature wrinkles. So it's thought that we should avoid too much time in the sun unprotected by sunscreen so that we can avoid getting skin cancer and wrinkles. Does UV radiation have any benefits, however? Yes, it does. UV radiation can act on a chemical that's found in skin and turn it into a precursor of vitamin D. And vitamin D is actually an important part of a vitamin D, calcium, and phosphorus pathway in the body. So in the small intestine, vitamin D increases the absorption of calcium and phosphorus. And then the calcium and the phosphorus are needed for bone maintenance and growth and metabolic and neuromuscular function. So ultraviolet radiation is certainly not all bad because it has this very beneficial effect of changing the chemical in our skin into pre-vitamin D. Then the vitamin D goes through changes in the liver, and the kidney is made into active vitamin D. Then that acts on the small intestine, which increases calcium and phosphate absorption from our foods. Calcium and phosphate go through the blood, and they can help with bone mineralization and other important functions of the body. Okay, so now let's talk for a moment about carotene, which is a yellow-orange pigment. It's found in plants like corn, carrot, and pumpkins. When carotene is eaten, it accumulates in keratinocytes and subcutaneous fat. Carotene helps to protect the skin from UV radiation. Carotene also has other benefits in the body. It can be converted to vitamin A, and vitamin A has important functions throughout the body, including in the retina, which is how come they sometimes say you should eat carrots because it will help your eyesight, kind of simplistically. And here's a picture of a woman that was in an experiment And in the experiment, they compared what would happen if she ate a lot of carotene. She turned sort of orangey, yellowy color, compared to what would happen if she got sun exposure and then she gets more melanin in her skin. Okay, hemoglobin also is a pigment that influences the color of our skin. The blood in the capillaries in the dermis of the skin is visible through the epidermis, and red blood cells contain a lot of hemoglobin, which carries oxygen and happens to contain a red pigment. So hemoglobin appears red, red blood cells appear red, and through the skin, we see kind of rosy red color. When capillaries dilate, for example, if you exercise a lot and you have to decrease your core body temperature by losing heat through your skin, which we'll talk about more a little later, or if you have a fever and your core body temperature is elevated, then more blood will be going through the dilated capillaries and the skin will look more red. When capillaries constrict, on the other hand, for example, if it's very cold or if you've lost a lot of blood, then less blood will enter the dermis and the skin will look more white. And this is something that you can use clinically to see whether a person has lost blood. You can actually look and see if they're white. Another color that skin can turn is a sort of bluish color. So if oxygen levels in the blood are decreased, and this could be because of, let's say, a respiratory condition like asthma or emphysema or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or it could be because there are decreased levels of oxygen in the environment, like if you were stuck in some place that had, and there was no source of air in it or something. But in any case, if oxygen levels in the blood are decreased, then levels of hemoglobin that are not bound to oxygen will increase because there won't be any oxygen to bind to the hemoglobin. In that case, there will be a lot of deoxyhemoglobin, or hemoglobin that doesn't have oxygen bound to it. And deoxyhemoglobin, rather than having a bright red color like oxygenated hemoglobin, typically has a dark reddish purple or even a bluish purple color. The bluish coloration will be seen through the skin, and that is called cyanosis of the skin. Okay, so we talked about keratinocytes a bit and about melanocytes. So now let's talk a moment about dendritic cells and Merkel cells. So dendritic cells, also called Langerhans cells, but I call them dendritic cells because Langerhans is an eponym, are phagocytes that are part of the immune system. They are found in the epidermis between keratinocytes, most commonly in the stratum spinosum. They are around 5% of the cells in the epidermis. They have a really important job. They engulf and chop up any pathogens that enter the epidermis. They then travel to lymph nodes where they show the parts of the pathogen that they've just chopped up to other cells of the immune system, and this activates the immune system. They are called dendritic cells because they have a lot of spiky looking branches on their surface. So going back here, this doesn't really do the dendritic cells justice. They really have very long, spiky looking branches all over their surface. They do a little better job of showing those little spiky branches here in this little tiny picture. I'll blow it up and you'll see here are the dendritic cells with the little spiky branches. Okay. You can read that little insert about the dendritic cells going to the lymph nodes. Okay, Merkel cells are specialized epithelial cells that are found in the stratum basale. When they are compressed, they release chemicals that stimulate sensory nerve endings. Each one of the Merkel cells has a little sensory nerve ending that's associated with it called a tactile disc. And here the Merkel cell is shown in purple and the tactile disc is shown in yellow. In this other picture over here from Martini's, the Merkel cells are shown in pink and the tactile discs are shown in black. Merkel cells respond to pressure, like when they're compressed, they release chemicals, and they can also detect fine touch. So the pressure can be very minimal, like fine touch, or it can be stronger so that you would actually call it a pressure on the skin. Merkel cells are especially common in the thin skin of the lips and the thick skin of the fingertips, where they respond to pressure. And I think of how sensitive the fingertips are, that people can even read Braille with their fingertips once they've been trained how to do it. So the epidermis, a word on epidermal ridges and dermal papillae. So the epidermis has deep epidermal ridges that interlock with superficial dermal papillae. So if we look down on the left here, we see the epidermal ridges interlocking with the dermal papillae in this picture. Okay, the ridges and papillae help the epidermis and the dermis stay connected so that the epidermis doesn't, get sloughed off the top of the dermis if there's friction on the surface of the skin, which happens quite often. Now, to help you remember these terms, epidermal ridges are part of the epidermis, and dermal papillae are part of the dermis. It's the second word that's the problem. They didn't choose one word, either ridges or papillae. They chose both, even though they're the same thing, basically, right? They're just, you know, protrusions of the different layers that interlock, right? So you're going to have to just try to memorize that the second word is ridges in one case and papillae in the other, okay? But the first word is actually quite helpful because it tells you what tissue these ridges are found in. Okay, so epidermal ridges are on the deep part of the epidermis. However, on the surface of the epidermis, in the fingers and the palms, there are epidermal ridges correlated with the deep epidermal ridges, but going in the other direction. Okay. I'm not sure if we have fingerprint type ridges on our palms. That's something I would have to look up. In any case, we definitely have epidermal ridges forming our fingerprints on our fingers. So why? Why do we have epidermal ridges? Well, epidermal ridges increase the surface area of the skin. So they increase the sensitivity of skin because more sensory receptors can fit onto the surface of the skin. And epidermal ridges improve friction between the hands and objects, increasing the ability of the hands to grip things. So I immediately thought of like holding like a cup or something. But imagine how this might have evolved during evolution when we often were climbing in trees and we needed to have really good grip on the tree so that if we prevent us from falling out of the tree and possibly getting killed. So really important that they improve friction in the hands. Okay, now the dermis.